Hello, I'm Dr. Matthew Cagle, curator here at Fort Ticonderoga, and I'm joined.
By TJ Mullen, exhibit designer and fabricator here at Fort Ticonderoga.
And TJ has been working on mounting the next iteration of our Revolutionary Anthology exhibit for 2026, which focuses on the theme of revolutionary possibilities. And right here we have a selection of artifacts that are going into one case exploring the experience of Loyalists during the Revolutionary War called Loyal Americans in Arms.
Yeah, this is a great collection of objects, and I'm excited to get them on display. Matt, can you tell me a little about this flag? This is really interesting. It's Royal Emigrants. I think they're called the Royal Highland Emigrants.
Absolutely. This is one of the most significant textiles, actually, in our collection. It's one of only 3 British camp colors that have survived from the American Revolutionary War, and it's the only one in the United States. There's 2 that match us, actually same regiment, same form and everything, that are in the Canadian War Museum's collection. Justifiably, they're national treasures.
Yeah.
This is the only one south of the international border, though. What's interesting about it is this isn't the big regimental flags that would have been carried by regiments. This is a small flag that every regiment would have had, about a dozen of them, and they were used to basically demarcate the bounds of a camp, where you would have your parade where the regiment would form up, so that when you had lots of regiments together, you could identify which section of which camp you were in at that time.
Interesting.
This is also unique because that stamp there that says Royal Emigrants, and then exactly as you say, it's the Royal Highland Emigrants. This is a Loyalist corps that was formed actually really as the war was beginning. They're one of the earliest Loyalist corps that were formed. Eventually, there's 2 battalions, one that's largely in the province of Quebec, and the second stationed in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And eventually, by kind of midway through the Revolutionary War, they're actually brought into the British Army as the 84th Regiment of Foot, which suggests that this flag predates that conversion to a regular regiment, when we would expect to see that number there instead of the name. In fact, this was probably made between 1776 and 1778. Wow. We can be that specific about it. It's very simply made. It's a piece of kind of blue serge, kind of a cheap twilled fabric, bound just with simple tape. It's very quickly sewn on. And the image there is actually stamped on. So there was a block covered in paint that was stamped right onto the wool. In fact, there were at least 3 separate blocks that were used to make this, because we've got the cipher of GR for Georgius Rex, the 3, so we know it's King George III. There's shading on that, which is a secondary block to give it a little movement, color. And then the title, Royal Emigrants, is a separate stamp beyond that that's been added to this. So these would have been manufactured basically en masse, because they're issuing new sets of these basically every year during the Revolutionary War to British and Loyalist Corps. It's a good segue also to this little guy here, which is maybe where you were headed next, because this John Small commanded the 2nd Battalion. He also, though, is not unrelated to our broader story here at Ticonderoga. He was a Scot, as you can tell by the portrait. He's wearing his belted plaid and Highland bonnet. He served in the Black Watch, the 42nd Regiment, during the French and Indian War. He survived the attack here on the lines in 1758. Later went on to get a commission in the 21st Regiment of Foot, the Royal North British Fusiliers. And he was at Bunker Hill when the war began. In fact, there's a famous painting by John Trumbull of death of General Warren at Bunker Hill. And famously, there's this grenadier about to bayonet this officer, and there's a British soldier, pushing him back. That's John Small.
Wow.
Yeah, that's him. He also got land grants after the French and Indian War in what is today Vermont, which made him an antagonist of Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys, because he claimed them under New York laws, and he actually brought one of the cases in the ejectment trials that leads to ultimately the creation of the Green Mountain Boys to contest New York's claims to Vermont.
Wow.
All before we see him in this picture, which admittedly is later than the Revolutionary War. This was painted in the 1790s, by the time that he had been a long-serving officer. But it reminds us of the long careers of some of these soldiers who, experienced the full breadth of colonial military service. And by this point, he was a governor of one of the Channel Islands in the English Channel off the coast of France. So quite a career for somebody who had seen service in both the French and Indian War and the Revolution.
Yeah. So speaking of long careers and Scots in America, I believe that this book belonged to Philip Skene.
Yeah, this is part of our Philip Skene collection. It's an interesting little book. It's all handwritten, it's all manuscript. It follows the form of what we often call the Army List, which is this publication that would have been printed in London, which laid out all of the commission dates and ranks of all the officers of all the regiments of the British Army. This book does that in manuscript form for all of the provincial regiments, so Loyalist regiments. We don't know exactly how he got it, but it's really interesting to go through because we get this detail about the officer corps of these loyal regiments. We know tens of thousands of Americans served in arms against the revolution during the war. And we see their names right here. What's interesting on the first page that gives us the list of brigadier generals in provincial service, and the junior brigadier commissioned in the end of 1780 is none other than Benedict Arnold.
Benedict Arnold.
Right there.
Yeah.
We get entries for a lot of the other regiments that we have represented through artifacts here. And one of the other interesting things that I find towards the end here is a short list, but lists of the officers of the Black Pioneers.
The Black Pioneers, who are they?
So this is a loyalist corps that was formed of free enslaved people who fled their rebel masters, got to British lines where the British offered them freedom. It's still a labor corps, so these aren't necessarily armed soldiers, but they were regimented and formalized within the provincial establishment, providing them not just freedom, but opportunity and at least some kind of small career within the British military establishment headquartered in New York, as well as having entries here for a lot of different regiments that are quite interesting and probably don't have the time to go into. Fortunately, this has been scanned and it's available on our online collections database, so anyone can look at this by pulling up the record.
So these Loyalist units were raised in America with the permission of the British government, but they were not necessarily part of the British Army. Is that correct?
Yeah, most of these units and most of what we had here are represented were Royal Provincial units. So they're not formally part of the British Army. They are being raised during wartime as this kind of expedient measure to help wage the war against the rebellious subjects of America, as the British saw it.
Well, I noticed these two muskets here, they're British Army muskets. They have tower-marked locks, but we have 1B superscript T NJV and 4BT NJV. So that's the Battalion of New Jersey Volunteers, correct?
Absolutely, yeah. So this is one of the provincial units that's raised specifically after the British conquered New York in 1776. Having that firm base of operation in New York City, especially as they push into New Jersey, opens up a lot of
fight at the Battle of Long Island. And
serves. They're able to open up these recruiting grounds in America to draw in these people who maybe didn't support the revolution and were willing to take up arms against that.
So what kinds of people do you see joining these loyalist groups?
I think there's a mindset in a lot of popular history that the Tories are kind of these arch conservatives. They're high class, dandy types that stay with the British. But within the ranks of the Loyalists, we see all different types of people. The same that you see in the Patriot Army, the Revolutionary Army.
Okay.
In fact, there's even a certain amount of people that move between Loyalist forces and the Continental Army, and both sides take deserters from the other. So people's allegiances changed. There truly was a lot of possibility during this period, depending on the flow of the war. And the New Jersey Volunteers, from which these two muskets come from, is an interesting example of that, because they got a lot of recruits after the British land in New York in 1776 and take the city. And so they form this regiment, and it is a regiment, but initially of 6 battalions, which is really strong and really unusual for a British regiment. But they felt that there was enough, manpower coming in that they could support this. Over time, though, as the kind of fortunes of war wax and wane, recruiting drops down, especially as the British are kind of pushed out of New Jersey, or at least the concentration of forces in New Jersey like they had over the winter of 1776. And so this regiment drops in strength down to 4 battalions, and they end up being only 3 battalions by the end of the war. And so we have one musket here marked to the 1st Battalion. This one is marked to the 4th Battalion, which at a certain point in time ceased to exist over the course of the war. It's interesting, too. These are they're perfectly serviceable arms for the time period of the Revolution. These are often known as a 1756 long land service musket. So this was the kind of new style that was coming into use at the end of the 7 Years' War. They're being made throughout the 1760s, but already by the time of the Revolution, they'd been superseded by slightly shorter barreled versions with some adapted hardware. So these are somewhat second-tier weapons that are being pulled out to issue to these provincial troops in this particular case.
How about this sword here? That's
Yeah.
an American-made sword, right?
This is an American-made sword, so this is not at all a British arm like these weapons, which are being issued to provincials. And most of the weapons being issued to provincials do come from British ordnance, British stores. This is an exception, though. This is a saber made by James Potter in New York, who was a New York City cutler, and was commissioned to make a few thousand of these for specifically provincial cavalry. So some of the units that had mounted troops, the Queen's Rangers, the British Legion, Bannister Tarleton's famous guys in the little green jackets and everything else, would have carried swords like these, which were highly regarded at the time, even though they're of colonial manufacture. Evidently, even Continental cavalrymen tried to secure them on the battlefield where they.
And this is a cavalry sword, right?
This is a cavalry sword.
Very
This
long.
Is, yeah,
I couldn't
this is
imagine
massive.
carrying that in the ranks.
No, not at all. But getting you the reach that you need from on horseback in the saddle, it does good work. And this pistol right here is related to that as well, because we know that provincial cavalry would have carried a sword typically and a pistol as well. This one is really interesting. This comes from the Robert Notolo collection. The top of the
that
barrel
it's
here.
engraved Lawler, is that what it says?
Yeah, Lawler on the top, and then on the trigger guard, it's engraved WDL, the initials. So in tracking this down, this appears to be the mark of William Digby Lawler. And this is an interesting case because Lawler was an Irishman who actually enlisted in a British regular regiment, the 17th Light Dragoons.
Okay, yeah.
And he rose through the ranks from a private trooper to a warrant officer, a quartermaster in one of the troops of the regiment. And it seems that at that point, there wasn't much space for him to rise further. He's not a nobleman, he's not a wealthy man, certainly didn't have the connections or the money to buy a commission to jump to that next step of elevation in the army. But given the task of being a quartermaster, clearly knew the work, knew the responsibility, had worked his way through corporal and sergeant. He had the skills. The Revolution and the Provincial Corps offered him, it seems, an opportunity to get up to that status because he is commissioned a cornet and then a lieutenant in the cavalry of the Queen's Rangers, where he may have carried this during both his regular and his provincial service. So it's an interesting reminder as well that the provincial troops also offered an opportunity for Britons. Now, some of them were people who had emigrated from the British Isles to America and then joined the provincial forces. Not unlike many immigrants that also joined continental forces. I mean, we talk about them as continental, as Americans. A lot of them were immigrants to America, especially from places like Ireland. So you could find those on both sides of this conflict. And a lot of the provincial regiments, too, were commanded by lieutenant colonels or major commandant who were themselves from Europe, like John Small or John Graves Simcoe, Bannister Tarleton. So they are a mix of composition between actual Britons and native-born Americans as well.
Okay. So this war, in fact, is an opportunity for provincials to rise in the ranks in the British Empire. So I think we have a portrait of Sir John Johnson here, the son of William Johnson, the first baronet. So he's born in America, but he has a title. What's that about?
Absolutely, yeah. His father, William Johnson, had been raised to the peerage as a baronet after the Battle of Lake George in 1755. And he became the superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Northern Department. His hugely important task of negotiating between native powers, particularly the Six Nations, and the British Empire. He died just before the Revolution began. So his son, Sir John, inherits the baronetcy, and I don't think it's surprising that if you have a baronetcy, you're going to stay loyal to the crown, and Sir John does. But he's, maybe a kind of elite example of the thousands of Americans that had to flee their homes, and he left his home in the Mohawk Valley.
And where does he go?
To Canada, where he raises a new Loyalist unit, which becomes known as the King's Royal Regiment of New York, one that actually expands during the course of the war from 1 to 2 battalions by the time the war is over. And they're one of the key units that operates out of Canada, out of the province of Quebec, raiding and pushing southward into the United States to disrupt the efforts there, often working alongside warriors from the Six Nations as well. Now, this portrait's probably a little before the war. It seems to be a copy of one that was done of him just before this, so, early 1770s. But he certainly takes a lead in this, leading this unit, organizing it over the course of the Revolutionary War. And, to that regard as well, right down here we've got a slip of paper which all of these officers would have carried.
Looks like a commission.
It's their commission, absolutely. This is one issued in America. It's different from the British officers' commissions that we have, which are issued in the name of the king.
Right.
This is done in America, so the commission is issued through the commander-in-chief at the time here in America. When this one was written, which is right at the end of the war in 1783, Guy Carleton, who had spent most of the war as the governor of Canada, is now commander-in-chief in New York.
You can see his signature down there in the bottom left-hand corner.
Exactly. His signature is right down there. This is an interesting commission. It's issued to James Hoyt, who was a Connecticut man, and it's commissioning him as the quartermaster in the Prince of Wales's American Regiment, which was heavily recruited in Connecticut.
Okay.
And, you know, a lot of Loyalists, obviously, New Jersey volunteers expect New Jersey. A lot of Loyalist units did have somewhat regional recruiting patterns. These guys are heavily recruited from Connecticut, and I think, like you see the same thing in Continental units, there's also a regionality to that. There's a connection in family members. This quartermaster's commission is actually commissioning him quartermaster in the place of his brother, Munson.
Oh, wow.
So he's just taking the role that his brother filled. Interestingly enough, his brother Munson's uniform actually survives today at the Connecticut Museum of History and Culture in Hartford, Connecticut.
Wow.
So a nice connection to some other artifacts and collections we have out there. And their uncle, Stephen Hoyt, was also a company commander in this regiment. And they're all from the same area of Norwalk, Connecticut. So again, these family connections are there, which I think underscores, too, how much the Revolution really was a civil war for a lot of the people that fought in it.
Yeah. So looks like we've got a gorget over there.
Yeah.
So what is a gorget? It looks like a piece of armor, maybe, but...
Yeah, a gorget is kind of the last vestige of armor. So it would have been worn kind of hanging below the neck of an officer. And originally, way back in the late Middle Ages, this would have been much wider, stronger, made of steel, and mounted on the throat between the helmet and the breastplate to provide protection to that vital area. Of course,
we're not protecting from lances in the 1770s.
No. Nor are we protecting from these in the 1770s. So by the time of the Revolution, this is purely decorative. It's symbolic. It identifies the wearer as an officer. That allusion to armor harkens back to the fact that in most of Europe, your officer corps is drawn from your nobility.
And the peerage were knights in the Middle Ages.
Exactly. So this is a reference to that service that once made them noble, as well as simply a marker that you have that the rank and file soldiers don't. And it, as you can see, it persists in the Loyalists. This is a Loyalist gorget. This one's particularly interesting. The engraving is really beautiful. This is worn by the King's American Regiment, and you can see down at the bottom here,
there's a number 4.
It's engraved 4 because the King's American Regiment was one of a small handful of provincial units that were actually brought on initially to what they called the American establishment. So effectively made part of the British Army, ensuring that the officers that served in them would get half pay that any British officer would get upon disbandment or retirement. So this was a real elevation in status. And I think from a material point of view, although the gilding has worn on this particular example, the quality of the engraving reminds us that the quality of this type of material, especially officers' appointments, uniforms, we'll talk more about our Jacob Schifflin uniform that we have here, are really high quality. The Loyalists knew to maintain a level of propriety and status equal to that of the regulars. I think they were eager to show that, these aren't just provincial boors. They're part of a metropolitan, cosmopolitan Atlantic community, and stuff like this really shows it.
Wow.
Now, on a very different scale, we've got something like this belt plate, which was actually found here at Fort Ticonderoga, although we don't know who wore it. It's a little unclear. The face is engraved GR, the abbreviation, of course, Georgius Rex for King George. These may have been worn by both some British regulars and some provincial units. They come out of sites with use by both. Interestingly enough, the back of it is just mounted with these kind of 4 lugs with holes drilled. So this would have been affixed to a shoulder belt. Although, oddly enough, it can't really move. It's just locked in
Right.
place.
It's not for hooking the belt closed. It's just a decorative.
It's just decorative, yeah. So this may have been worn by some Loyalist corps that passed through here. We see a number of Royalist units coming out of Canada, for instance, during John Burgoyne's expedition in 1777. Not all of them may have had the time to be as well equipped as this, but we also see Loyalist troops that come back here in 1781 under Barry St. Ledger's command that are more properly uniformed and equipped by that later point in the war. Could have been found or lost by one of those units at that point in time. But again, reminds us very clearly who these Loyalists were fighting for. It is their king. It is the laws of Great Britain that they have grown up under and prospered under. And why would they fight against that in some ways?
Yeah.
It's an interesting question for us to look at today about the choices that all of these individuals made to support one side or the other.
Yeah. I think we forget how long we were British before we became Americans.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, these people would have, many of them, grown up with this. They knew no
Yeah.
other way.
I think there were 9 monarchs of Britain in the time that they came to America, and then the American Revolution
To the
happened.
War of Independence.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's remarkable to think about, and I think it does help us reflect on the complexity of the Revolutionary War as we enter this anniversary year, 2026, which is rather important for the history of the United States.
Yeah. Well,
Thank you.
thank you for showing me all this stuff. I learned a lot, and I can't wait to put it on exhibit now.
Yeah, you can see this on display in our Revolutionary Anthology, Revolutionary Possibilities. This particular case is Loyal Americans in Arms. It will be up throughout 2026. Thank you.